There is a war being fought inside your head right now, and you probably don't even know it. It's not a war between good and evil, or between logic and emotion, though it sometimes feels that way. It's a war between different versions of yourself, between what you believe and what you do, between who you think you are and who your actions reveal you to be. This war has a name, and understanding it might be one of the most important things you ever do. It's called cognitive dissonance, and it shapes nearly every decision you make, every belief you hold, and every relationship you maintain. The term sounds clinical, almost sterile, like something you'd find in a psychology textbook gathering dust on a library shelf. But make no mistake, cognitive dissonance is anything but dry or academic. It's the reason you defended that expensive purchase to your friends, even though you secretly regretted it. It's why you keep dating people who treat you poorly while insisting you deserve better. It's the force that keeps people trapped in jobs they hate, beliefs that harm them, and patterns that lead nowhere good. And paradoxically, it's also the engine that drives personal growth, the discomfort that eventually pushes us toward becoming better versions of ourselves. To understand cognitive dissonance is to understand something fundamental about human nature. We are not the purely rational creatures we like to imagine ourselves to be. We are rationalizing creatures, constantly spinning stories to make sense of the contradictions we carry within us. This essay will take you deep into the heart of this phenomenon, exploring where it comes from, how it operates, why it matters, and most importantly, what you can do about it. By the time you finish reading, you will never see yourself or other people quite the same way again.
The smoky room where your laughter used to live. What a strange and bitter crop. Love that withers never stops, haunting me from branch to root.
The birth of a revolutionary idea. The story of cognitive dissonance begins, appropriately enough, with a contradiction. In the early 1950s, a young social psychologist named Leon Festinger was studying something that seemed utterly irrational: a doomsday cult. The group, led by a woman they called Marion Keech, believed she was receiving messages from extraterrestrial beings, warning of an impending flood that would destroy the world. The faithful were told that if they gathered together and demonstrated their commitment, they would be rescued by flying saucers before the catastrophe. Festinger and his colleagues infiltrated the group, posing as believers while secretly documenting everything that happened. They were particularly interested in what would occur when the prophecy inevitably failed. Common sense would suggest that when the world didn't end and no spacecraft arrived, the believers would recognize they had been fooled. They would abandon their beliefs, feel embarrassed, and try to return to normal life. That's what rational people would do, right? But that's not what happened at all. When the appointed hour came and went with no flood and no rescue, the group didn't dissolve in disillusionment. Instead, something remarkable occurred. Marion Keech announced that she had received a new message. The group's faith had been so strong that God had decided to spare the world. Rather than being chastened by the failed prophecy, the believers became more fervent than ever. Members who had previously kept their beliefs private suddenly began evangelizing, calling newspapers, and trying to convert anyone who would listen. Festinger watched this transformation with fascination. Here were people confronted with undeniable evidence that their beliefs were wrong, and instead of changing their minds, they had doubled down. Why would they do something so seemingly irrational? The answer, Festinger realized, lay in understanding the psychological pressure they were under. These believers had sacrificed enormously for their faith. Many had quit their jobs, given away their possessions, and alienated their families. They had publicly committed to beliefs that now looked foolish. If they admitted they were wrong, they would have to face the devastating conclusion that all their sacrifices had been for nothing, that they had been gullible fools who had destroyed their lives chasing a delusion. The psychological cost of accepting this truth was simply too high. So instead of changing their beliefs to fit the facts, they changed their interpretation of the facts to fit their beliefs. The cognitive dissonance between their commitment and the failed prophecy was resolved not through rational reassessment, but through creative reinterpretation, and crucially, seeking social support from others who shared their beliefs helped reduce the dissonance further. Every new convert was proof that they weren't crazy, that their beliefs had merit. From this observation, Festinger developed his theory of cognitive dissonance, which he published in 1957 in a book that would become one of the most influential works in the history of psychology. The core idea was elegantly simple. Humans have a fundamental need for internal consistency. When we hold two contradictory cognitions, whether they are beliefs, attitudes, or awareness of our own behaviors, we experience psychological discomfort. This discomfort motivates us to reduce the contradiction, and we will go to remarkable lengths to do so.
Small steps forward through the night into morning, into light, getting better day by day, finding my way.
What exactly is cognitive dissonance? Let's break down the concept more precisely. A cognition is simply any piece of knowledge you have about yourself, your behavior, or the world around you. It could be a belief, like thinking honesty is important. It could be an awareness of something you've done, like knowing you lied to a friend yesterday. It could be a perception of the world, like believing that smoking causes cancer. It could be a piece of self-knowledge, like considering yourself a kind person. Now, cognitions can relate to each other in three ways. They can be consonant, meaning they fit together harmoniously. If you believe honesty is important, and you tell the truth consistently, those cognitions are consonant. They reinforce each other, and you feel psychologically comfortable. Cognitions can also be irrelevant to each other. Your belief that honesty matters has nothing to do with your preference for chocolate ice cream. These cognitions simply don't interact, so there's no psychological tension between them. But when cognitions are dissonant, that's when things get interesting. Dissonance occurs when one cognition implies the opposite of another. If you believe honesty is important but you just told a significant lie, those two cognitions are in direct conflict. The belief that smoking causes cancer is dissonant with the behavior of smoking a pack a day. The self-concept of being a loving parent conflicts with the awareness that you just screamed at your child over something trivial. The experience of dissonance is not merely intellectual disagreement with yourself. It carries genuine psychological and even physical discomfort. Research has shown that cognitive dissonance activates the same brain regions associated with pain and negative emotions. People experiencing dissonance show increased activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, a region involved in detecting conflicts and errors. They often report feeling uneasy, tense, or anxious, though they may not be able to identify why. The magnitude of dissonance depends on several factors. First, the importance of the cognitions matters enormously. Dissonance between trivial beliefs causes little distress, but dissonance involving core values or identity creates intense pressure. If you consider yourself an environmentalist but just bought a gas-guzzling SUV, the dissonance will be far more painful than if you consider environmental issues to be relatively unimportant. Second, the ratio of dissonant to consonant cognitions affects the overall pressure. If you have many good reasons supporting your decision and only one element that conflicts, the dissonance will be manageable. But if the contradicting cognition stands largely alone against your other beliefs, the tension becomes much harder to ignore. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the degree of choice involved amplifies dissonance dramatically. If you are forced to do something that conflicts with your beliefs, you can attribute your behavior to external pressure, and the dissonance remains limited. But if you freely chose to act against your values, you cannot escape responsibility so easily. The contradiction becomes a statement about who you really are, and that's much harder to live with.
Dance away the blues, baby. Move it until it's gone. Shake off all the pain, baby. Keep dancing till the dawn.
The many faces of dissonance reduction. When we experience cognitive dissonance, we are powerfully motivated to reduce it. The psychological pressure demands resolution, and our minds are remarkably creative in finding ways to achieve it. Understanding these strategies is essential because they operate largely below conscious awareness, shaping our thoughts and beliefs in ways we rarely recognize. The most straightforward way to reduce dissonance is to change one of the conflicting cognitions. If you believe smoking is harmful and you smoke, you could quit smoking. Problem solved. The behavior now aligns with the belief and harmony is restored. This is the healthiest response to dissonance in many cases, but it's often the hardest because it requires actually changing something about yourself or your life. When changing behavior proves too difficult or costly, we often take the easier route of changing our beliefs. The smoker might start questioning whether the health risks are really as serious as claimed. Maybe those studies were flawed. Maybe the dangers are exaggerated by people with an agenda. Maybe their grandfather smoked until 95, so genetics matter more than behavior anyway. By adjusting beliefs to fit behavior, the dissonance dissolves without requiring any actual change in conduct. Another common strategy is adding new cognitions that bridge the gap between the conflicting ones. The smoker acknowledges that cigarettes are harmful, but adds the cognition that smoking helps manage stress, and stress is also harmful to health. Or perhaps they note that life is short anyway, so they might as well enjoy it. Or they point out that they exercise regularly and eat well, which surely offsets the smoking. Each new cognition doesn't eliminate the original contradiction, but dilutes it, making it easier to tolerate. We can also reduce dissonance by minimizing the importance of the conflicting cognitions. Yes, smoking is harmful, but so are lots of things. Life is full of risks. We could get hit by a car tomorrow. Compared to all the other threats we face, smoking is just one more, and probably not the worst. By shrinking the significance of the contradiction, we make it easier to live with. Sometimes we reduce dissonance by seeking social support for our position. If everyone around us shares our beliefs or engages in the same behaviors, the contradiction feels less troubling. The smoker who hangs out with other smokers can reassure themselves that their habit isn't so unusual or concerning. This is why people often surround themselves with others who share their views and avoid those who challenge them. Every agreeing voice quiets the internal dissonance. Perhaps the most insidious strategy is selective exposure and attention. We actively seek out information that supports our existing beliefs while avoiding or dismissing information that challenges them. The smoker reads articles about centenarians who smoked their whole lives while scrolling past studies on lung cancer. We're not consciously manipulating our information diet. It simply feels natural to gravitate toward things that make us comfortable and away from things that disturb us. The classic experiments that revealed our self-deception. The theory of cognitive dissonance generated an explosion of research, with psychologists devising clever experiments to demonstrate just how far people would go to resolve internal contradictions. These studies remain fascinating decades later because they reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature that we would often prefer not to acknowledge. One of the most famous experiments was conducted by Festinger himself, along with his colleague James Carl-Smith in 1959. Participants were asked to perform an incredibly boring task, spending an hour turning wooden pegs on a board, 1/4 turn at a time, over and over again. The task was deliberately designed to be as tedious as possible. After completing this mind-numbing exercise, participants were asked to do something strange. The researcher explained that his assistant hadn't shown up and asked if the participant would be willing to tell the next person waiting to do the experiment that the task was actually interesting and enjoyable. Some participants were offered $20 for this small lie, while others were offered only $1. Later, all participants were asked to rate how much they had actually enjoyed the peg-turning task. Here's where it gets interesting. You might expect that people who were paid more would report enjoying the task more. After all, they received a bigger reward, so they should feel better about the experience, right? But the opposite occurred. Participants who were paid only $1 rated the task as significantly more enjoyable than those who were paid $20. The explanation lies in cognitive dissonance. Everyone who lied to the next participant experienced dissonance between their cognition of having said the task was enjoyable and their knowledge that it was actually boring. But those who received $20 had an easy way to resolve this dissonance. They lied for the money. A substantial payment provides sufficient external justification for telling a small lie. The dissonance is minimal because the behavior can be attributed to the reward rather than to genuine belief. But what about those who received only $1? That amount wasn't enough to justify lying, even in 1959. They couldn't tell themselves they lied for the money, because $1 seems like a trivial reason to be dishonest. So, to reduce the dissonance, they had to change their internal belief about the task. They convinced themselves that maybe it wasn't so boring after all. Maybe it was actually kind of interesting. By adjusting their attitude to match their behavior, they eliminated the contradiction between what they said and what they believed. This experiment revealed something profound. We don't just believe things and then act on those beliefs. The relationship flows in both directions. Our actions shape our beliefs just as much as our beliefs shape our actions. When we behave in ways that don't match our attitudes, we often adjust our attitudes to match our behavior rather than the other way around. Another landmark study explored what researchers called the effort justification effect. Elliot Aronson and Judson Mills had women undergo either a mild or severe initiation to join a discussion group about the psychology of sex. The mild initiation involved reading some slightly embarrassing words aloud. The severe initiation required reading highly explicit sexual material and crude slang in front of a male experimenter, which was genuinely mortifying for young women in 1959. After completing their initiation, all participants listened to the same discussion group, which had been deliberately designed to be as boring and disappointing as possible. The members spoke in monotones about secondary sex characteristics in lower animals, using dry academic jargon and constantly contradicting each other. When asked to evaluate the discussion group afterward, women who had undergone the severe initiation rated it as significantly more interesting and valuable than those who had experienced the mild initiation. The embarrassing ordeal they had suffered created dissonance. Why would they put themselves through something so uncomfortable for a group that was actually dull and disappointing? To reduce this dissonance, they convinced themselves that the group must actually be worthwhile. Their suffering had to mean something. This effect has enormous implications for understanding human behavior. It helps explain why fraternity hazings and military boot camps create intense loyalty. It illuminates why people who sacrifice greatly for a cause become its most fervent defenders. It reveals why expensive products sometimes seem more valuable simply because we paid more for them. The effort we invest in something becomes justification for valuing it, regardless of its actual worth. The spreading of alternatives. One of the most reliable and revealing effects of cognitive dissonance occurs after we make difficult decisions. Whenever we choose between two attractive options, we experience dissonance because the choice implies that we're giving up the good features of the rejected option while accepting the drawbacks of the chosen one. Our minds resolve this dissonance in a predictable way. We increase our evaluation of the chosen option and decrease our evaluation of the rejected one. Researchers call this the spreading of alternatives, or post-decision dissonance reduction. In a classic demonstration of this effect, Jack Brame had women rate the desirability of various household appliances. Then they were told they could have one of two appliances as a gift. For some participants, the choice was between two items they had rated very similarly, making the decision difficult. For others, the choice was between items they had rated quite differently, making the decision easy. After making their choice and receiving their gift, participants rated all the appliances again. Those who had made a difficult choice showed a significant spreading apart of their evaluations. The chosen appliance was now rated even more favorably than before, while the rejected one was rated less favorably. Those who had made an easy choice showed little change. When the decision was already clear, there was minimal dissonance to resolve. This spreading of alternatives happens automatically and below conscious awareness. We don't decide to like our choices more. We simply find ourselves feeling more positive about them, and this effect has consequences that extend far beyond appliance preferences. Consider how this applies to major life decisions. You deliberate between 2 job offers, 2 potential romantic partners, 2 cities to live in. You weigh the options carefully and eventually you choose. But the moment you commit to one path, your mind begins working to justify that choice. The selected job becomes the obviously right opportunity, its benefits magnified and its drawbacks minimized. The person you chose to date becomes more attractive and wonderful in your eyes. The city you move to reveals new charms you hadn't noticed before. Meanwhile, the paths not taken start to look worse in retrospect. The rejected job offer seems less appealing now that you've turned it down. The person you didn't choose develops flaws you had previously overlooked. The city you didn't move to seems glad you avoided it. This process serves an important psychological function. It prevents us from being paralyzed by regret or constantly second-guessing ourselves. Once a decision is made, we need to move forward with confidence, rather than remaining stuck in endless rumination. The spreading of alternatives helps us commit to our choices and feel satisfied with them. But there's a dark side to this mental maneuver. It means we're not accurately evaluating our options before decisions, and we're certainly not accurately evaluating them afterward. Our minds are constantly manipulating our perceptions to serve psychological comfort rather than truth. We think we're rationally assessing the world, but we're actually rationalizing our place in it. Free choice and the illusion of responsibility. One of the most important factors influencing cognitive dissonance is the perception of free choice. When we feel we've freely chosen to do something that conflicts with our attitudes, the dissonance is maximum because we can't attribute our behavior to external forces. We must own it as a reflection of ourselves, which creates enormous pressure to bring our attitudes into line with our actions. This principle has been demonstrated repeatedly in studies on induced compliance, where people are asked to argue for positions they don't actually hold. The key variable is how much choice they feel they have in the matter. When people feel they were forced or strongly pressured to advocate a position, they experience little dissonance and their actual attitudes remain unchanged. But when they feel they freely chose to make arguments against their own beliefs, substantial attitude change occurs to reduce the dissonance. The implications of this finding are significant and somewhat disturbing. It suggests that the most effective way to change someone's attitude is not to force them to comply with your wishes, but to create conditions where they feel they're freely choosing to act against their current beliefs. Heavy-handed pressure actually protects people's existing attitudes by providing an external explanation for their behavior. But subtle inducement that preserves the sense of free choice leaves them with no such protection. This insight has been applied and sometimes exploited in many domains. Effective salespeople know that high-pressure tactics often backfire because customers can attribute their purchase to being pressured rather than genuine desire. Better to create conditions where customers convince themselves. Skilled negotiators understand that people are more committed to agreements they feel they reached freely, rather than ones forced upon them. Even cult recruitment relies heavily on creating the illusion of free choice so that members experience maximum dissonance, reduction, and attitude change. The role of choice in cognitive dissonance also illuminates something important about human psychology. We have a deep need to see ourselves as the authors of our own actions. When we can't attribute our behavior to external causes, we're forced to attribute it to internal ones. This means our behavior becomes a statement about who we are, which makes it crucial that our stated attitudes match our exhibited actions. This may be why people often become more committed to behaviors over time, even problematic ones. Each time you freely choose to engage in a behavior, it becomes more deeply incorporated into your self-concept. The smoker who lights up day after day, always feeling they could quit if they wanted to, builds an ever stronger identity as a smoker. The dissonance between knowing cigarettes are harmful and continuing to choose them is resolved by changing their internal attitudes towards smoking, making it seem less dangerous, more enjoyable, more integral to who they are. The hypocrisy paradigm. Building on the principles of cognitive dissonance, researchers have developed practical applications that use dissonance to promote positive behavior change. One of the most successful is the hypocrisy paradigm, developed by Elliot Aronson and his students. The technique works by making people publicly commit to a position they already believe, and then making them mindful of times they failed to act consistently with that position. This induced hypocrisy creates powerful dissonance that motivates behavioral change. In one study, college students were asked to compose a speech about the importance of safe sex and condom use to be shown to high school students. This public commitment was the first component. Then, some students were asked to think about and list times they had failed to use condoms themselves. This mindfulness of past failures was the second component. Students who experience both components, making a public commitment while being reminded of their own inconsistent behavior, showed significant increases in condom use over the following months compared to students who experienced only one component or neither. The dissonance between preaching safe sex and remembering unsafe sex was resolved through actually changing behavior. This technique has been successfully applied to many domains, from water conservation to reducing prejudice behavior to increasing exercise. The key is that people must feel they are freely advocating a position they genuinely believe in, and they must be personally confronted with their own failures to live up to that belief. External criticism or forced confession doesn't create the same effect. The dissonance must arise from within. The hypocrisy paradigm works because it takes something we all experience, the gap between our ideals and our actions, and makes it salient in a way that demands resolution. Most of the time, we manage to avoid noticing our own hypocrisy. We compartmentalize, we make excuses, we simply don't think about it. But when we're forced to confront the contradiction directly, especially after publicly committing to our ideals, the dissonance becomes too intense to ignore through our usual strategies. Actual behavior change becomes the path of least resistance. Cognitive dissonance and self-concept. At the heart of cognitive dissonance lies our self-concept, the collection of beliefs we hold about who we are. Many researchers have argued that dissonance is most intense when it threatens our view of ourselves, particularly our sense of being a good, capable, and consistent person. Elliot Aronson proposed that dissonance is greatest when behavior conflicts with the self-concept, not just with any belief. We can tolerate some inconsistency in our abstract beliefs about the world, but we struggle to tolerate inconsistency in our beliefs about ourselves. When we do something that suggests we're not as smart, moral, or competent as we thought, the dissonance is acute because it threatens the very foundation of our identity. This perspective helps explain why certain kinds of dissonance are so much more disturbing than others. Finding out that two of your beliefs about economics are contradictory might be intellectually unsettling, but is unlikely to cause deep distress. But discovering that you've been cruel to someone when you think of yourself as a kind person creates a different kind of anguish. Your behavior has revealed something about yourself that you didn't want to see. The self-concept theory of dissonance also explains why people with high self-esteem often show stronger dissonance effects than those with low self-esteem. If you have a strong positive view of yourself, any behavior that contradicts that view creates enormous dissonance. But if you already doubt yourself, negative behavior is less surprising and less threatening to your self-concept. The person who sees themselves as kind is more disturbed by an act of cruelty than the person who already questions their own goodness. This has important implications for personal growth and change. Many self-help approaches try to build self-esteem first, on the theory that feeling good about yourself will lead to better behavior. But cognitive dissonance research suggests the relationship might work the other way around. Behavior shapes self-concept. If you want to see yourself as a certain kind of person, act like that kind of person. The dissonance between your actions and your old self-concept will push you toward adopting a new self-concept that matches your actions. The role of dissonance in belief perseverance. Cognitive dissonance helps explain one of the most frustrating aspects of human psychology: why people cling to beliefs even in the face of overwhelming contradictory evidence. This phenomenon, known as belief perseverance, makes more sense when we understand the dissonance that would be created by changing our minds. Admitting you were wrong about something creates dissonance with your self-concept as a rational, competent person. If you've publicly advocated a position, changing your mind creates dissonance between your current and past statements. If you've made decisions based on a belief, abandoning it implies those decisions were mistakes. The more you've invested in a belief, the more costly it becomes to abandon it, and the more creative you'll be in finding reasons to hold on. This is why simply presenting people with facts that contradict their beliefs often backfires. The contradictory evidence creates dissonance, but rather than changing the belief, people find ways to dismiss, reinterpret, or ignore the evidence. They might question the source, find methodological flaws in studies, or simply decide the evidence doesn't apply to their particular situation. The belief perseveres because changing it would be psychologically costly. Researchers have documented this pattern across many domains. People who believe in the effectiveness of a therapy continue believing even when shown evidence it doesn't work. Political partisans interpret the same ambiguous evidence as supporting their side. Investors who've lost money on a stock find reasons to hold on rather than admit their original analysis was wrong. Once we've committed to a position, we become lawyers for that position, skilled at finding arguments to defend it and dismissing arguments against it. Understanding belief perseverance through the lens of cognitive dissonance suggests that changing minds requires more than just presenting evidence. It requires making it psychologically safe to change, reducing the identity threat that comes with admitting error, and providing alternative beliefs that can maintain self-esteem while incorporating new information. Cognitive dissonance and moral behavior. The relationship between cognitive dissonance and moral behavior is complex and sometimes troubling. Dissonance can push us toward better behavior when we fall short of our ideals, as in the hypocrisy paradigm. But it can also be deployed in service of rationalizing wrongdoing. When we do something that violates our moral standards, the dissonance demands resolution. One option is to make amends and recommit to our values, but another option is to adjust our moral standards to make the behavior seem acceptable. Each time we take this second path, our morality shifts slightly, making it easier to repeat and even escalate the behavior. This process helps explain how ordinary people can gradually descend into evil. They don't start out intending to do terrible things. They start with small transgressions that create manageable dissonance, which they resolve by slightly adjusting their moral standards. This makes the next slightly larger transgression possible, which creates more dissonance, which is resolved by further moral adjustment. Step by step, people can talk themselves into behaviors they never would have considered acceptable at the outset. Researchers have demonstrated this slippery slope in laboratory studies. Participants who agree to tell a small lie become more willing to tell larger lies later. Those who administer mild punishments to others become more willing to administer severe ones. Each act that violates the initial moral standard makes the next violation easier because the standard itself has shifted. This understanding of moral dissonance has important implications for maintaining ethical behavior. The most dangerous moral compromises are not the large, obvious ones that clearly conflict with our values. They're the small ones that seem trivial at the time, but begin the process of rationalization. Once you've justified one small transgression, you've developed tools for justifying larger ones. The key is to be vigilant about the small choices, recognizing that each one shapes not just what you do, but what kind of person you become. On the positive side, the same mechanism can work in reverse. Each time you resist temptation and act according to your values, you strengthen your commitment to those values. Doing the right thing makes you more the kind of person who does the right thing. The behavior shapes the self-concept, which influences future behavior, creating an upward spiral of moral development. Dissonance across cultures. When cognitive dissonance was first studied, researchers assumed it represented a universal feature of human psychology. The drive for consistency seemed so fundamental that it should appear across all cultures. But as researchers began conducting studies outside Western contexts, a more nuanced picture emerged. Studies in East Asian cultures, particularly Japan, found different patterns of dissonance effects. In the classic free choice paradigm, where participants choose between two attractive options and then rate them more differently afterward, Japanese participants often showed weaker effects than American participants. Similar patterns appeared in other dissonance paradigms. Researchers propose several explanations for these cultural differences. One possibility is that cultures differ in the importance they place on individual consistency. In Western cultures that emphasize individual identity and personal responsibility, consistency between attitudes and behavior is highly valued, but in cultures that emphasize social harmony and role-based behavior, there may be less expectation that individuals will be internally consistent across situations. Another possibility is that the self is construed differently across cultures. In Western cultures, the self is often understood as an independent entity, defined by internal attributes that should remain stable. But in East Asian cultures, the self is more often understood as interdependent and contextual, defined by relationships and social roles. Behavior that varies across contexts might not threaten the self-concept, because consistency across contexts is not part of how the self is defined. However, subsequent research found that when situations involved public behavior or social evaluation, participants from East Asian cultures showed strong dissonance effects. The trigger seemed to be different, not personal inconsistency, but social inconsistency, appearing unreliable or inconsistent to others. This suggests that while dissonance may be universal, what triggers it varies based on cultural values and self-construal. The cultural research on cognitive dissonance teaches us that while humans everywhere may have a need for some form of consistency, the specific manifestations depend on what kind of consistency their culture prioritizes. There's not just one way to experience or resolve dissonance. Cultural context shapes both the situations that create dissonance and the strategies we use to reduce it. Cognitive dissonance and relationships. The dynamics of cognitive dissonance play out powerfully in our relationships with others. From romantic partnerships to friendships to family ties, dissonance shapes how we perceive, evaluate, and maintain our connections with other people. When we choose a romantic partner, we're typically choosing between multiple potential alternatives. The moment we commit, dissonance begins doing its work. We become more convinced that our partner is wonderful while simultaneously becoming more critical of the paths not taken. Former romantic interests start to look less attractive in retrospect. This is the spreading of alternatives applied to love, and it serves to cement our commitment to the chosen relationship. But this process has its dangers. The same cognitive machinery that bonds us to our partner can keep us trapped in relationships that have become harmful. If you've invested years in a relationship, admitting it was a mistake creates enormous dissonance. It implies not just that the relationship failed, but that you made a bad choice, that you wasted your time, that you weren't as perceptive as you thought. To avoid this painful conclusion, you might minimize the relationship's problems, rationalize your partner's harmful behavior, or convince yourself that things will improve despite evidence to the contrary. This is one reason why leaving bad relationships is so difficult. The psychological barriers are not just about fear of change or love for the partner. They're about protecting the self-concept from the implications of having stayed so long in something so wrong. Every additional day of investment increases the dissonance that would be created by leaving, which paradoxically can make people stay even longer. Cognitive dissonance also influences how we respond to information about the people we love. When we hear criticism of someone we care about, we experience dissonance between our positive view of them and the negative information. To reduce this dissonance, we often dismiss the criticism, question the source, or reinterpret the behavior in question. We become defense attorneys for those we love, skilled at explaining away evidence that conflicts with our devotion. This tendency can be beautiful in its loyalty, but dangerous in its blindness. Partners of abusive people often struggle to see the abuse clearly because acknowledging it would create unbearable dissonance with their feelings of love and their decisions to stay. Family members of addicts make excuses and enable harmful behavior because accepting the truth would be too painful. We think we're seeing clearly, but our vision is distorted by the need to protect our relationships and the self-concept tied to them. Understanding dissonance in relationships can help us develop healthier patterns. It suggests being cautious about over-investing in relationships too quickly before you really know whether they're healthy. It encourages soliciting outside perspectives from people who haven't invested in your relationship and thus don't need to justify it. It means being suspicious of your own rationalizations when something feels wrong, recognizing that your mind has powerful incentives to preserve the status quo. Dissonance in the marketplace. Marketers and advertisers have long intuited the principles of cognitive dissonance, using them to influence consumer behavior in ways both ethical and manipulative. Understanding these applications can make you a more conscious consumer and help you resist influences you might not otherwise notice. One common application is in creating post-purchase satisfaction. Immediately after making a major purchase, consumers often experience dissonance between their spending and the possibility that they made a wrong choice. Smart marketers reduce this dissonance by sending congratulatory messages, reinforcing the wisdom of the purchase, and providing information that confirms the product's value. This isn't just customer service, it's dissonance management designed to prevent returns and encourage positive word of mouth. The effort justification effect is exploited when companies make you work for their product or service. Subscription services that are difficult to set up can actually generate more commitment because the effort invested creates dissonance that is resolved by valuing the service more highly. Loyalty programs that require substantial point accumulation before rewards can be claimed create investment that makes customers reluctant to switch to competitors. The more you put in, the more you convince yourself it's worthwhile. Scarcity and exclusivity leverage dissonance in interesting ways. When you manage to acquire something that's rare or difficult to obtain, the effort involved enhances your appreciation of the item. This is why limited editions feel more special and why waiting lists for products can actually increase demand. The dissonance between effort expended and the possibility of disappointment is resolved by perceiving the outcome as more valuable. Foot-in-the-door techniques use dissonance explicitly. Getting someone to make a small commitment changes their self-concept slightly, creating pressure to maintain consistency with that new self-image. The person who agrees to sign a petition in favor of environmental protection has now made a small commitment to that cause. When later asked to make a donation, they're more likely to comply because refusing would create dissonance with their newly affirmed identity as someone who cares about the environment. High-pressure sales tactics can backfire precisely because they provide external justification for purchasing decisions. If you feel pressured into buying something, you can attribute your decision to the pressure rather than genuine desire, which limits attitude change. This is why more sophisticated sales approaches create conditions for customers to persuade themselves, reducing explicit pressure while maintaining subtle influence. Understanding these dynamics doesn't make you immune to them, but it does provide valuable awareness. When you notice yourself feeling strongly committed to a purchase or brand, ask whether that commitment reflects genuine value or psychological investment. When a decision feels difficult, recognize that the spreading of alternatives will kick in afterward, and your post-decision feelings may not reflect the true comparison you made before deciding. The political mind and dissonance. Perhaps nowhere is cognitive dissonance more consequential than in the domain of politics. Our political beliefs are often deeply tied to our identities, our communities, and our sense of right and wrong. This makes political dissonance particularly intense, and the mechanisms for reducing it particularly powerful. When people encounter information that contradicts their political beliefs, they rarely update those beliefs accordingly. Instead, they deploy an arsenal of dissonance-reducing strategies. They question the source of the information, looking for bias or ulterior motives. They find methodological flaws in studies that produce unwanted conclusions, while accepting without scrutiny studies that confirm their views. They reinterpret ambiguous evidence to support their position or simply avoid exposure to challenging information altogether. This selective processing creates a kind of motivated reasoning where we think we're evaluating evidence objectively but are actually constructing arguments for predetermined conclusions. We become lawyers for our political team rather than judges weighing evidence fairly. And the smarter we are, the better we are at this lawyering, which is why intelligence doesn't protect against political bias. It may actually amplify it by providing more sophisticated tools for rationalization. Political polarization is intensified by cognitive dissonance dynamics. As people become more publicly identified with a political position, admitting error becomes increasingly costly to self-concept. They've likely alienated friends or family members who disagree, made predictions about political consequences, and woven their political identity into their understanding of who they are. Changing their mind would require acknowledging that all of this was mistaken, a psychological cost that grows with each additional commitment. This helps explain the strange phenomenon where political opponents can look at exactly the same events or data and reach completely opposite conclusions, each side convinced the evidence clearly supports their view. They're not lying or being deliberately obtuse. They're genuinely experiencing the information differently because their minds are processing it through the filter of dissonance reduction. The escalation of commitment that dissonance produces can lead to political extremism. As people defend increasingly extreme versions of their positions, they experience pressure to continue in that direction rather than back down. Admitting that their earlier, more extreme statements were wrong would create painful dissonance, so they double down instead. Each step toward extremism makes the next step easier and the path back harder. Understanding these dynamics won't solve political polarization, but it might help in several ways. It can promote intellectual humility by recognizing that we're all subject to these biases, not just our opponents. It can encourage seeking out genuinely challenging information rather than comfortable confirmation. It can suggest that persuasion is more effective when it doesn't trigger identity threat, when it provides face-saving ways to update beliefs. And it can remind us that people who disagree with us are usually not stupid or evil. They're often intelligent people whose reasoning is being shaped by the same psychological forces that shape ours. Dissonance and health behavior. Health behavior provides a rich domain for observing cognitive dissonance in action. Many of the behaviors that threaten our health are things we know are harmful but continue doing anyway, creating constant tension between knowledge and action. Smokers know that cigarettes cause cancer, heart disease, and a host of other ailments. Yet many continue smoking, creating a textbook case of cognitive dissonance. How do they manage this contradiction? The strategies are varied and often quite creative. Some minimize the risks, telling themselves the dangers are exaggerated or that they're somehow special and won't be affected. Some point to countervailing behaviors, emphasizing that they exercise or eat well to offset the smoking. Some invoke fatalism, noting that everyone dies of something and at least they're enjoying themselves. Some seek social support, surrounding themselves with other smokers who reinforce the normalcy of the behavior. What's striking is that these rationalizations aren't conscious lies people tell others. They're beliefs people genuinely hold. The dissonance reduction has changed their actual perception of reality. When smokers assess risk, they genuinely perceive smoking as less dangerous than non-smokers do. This isn't strategic misrepresentation, it's motivated cognition at work. Similar patterns appear across unhealthy behaviors. The person who knows they should exercise but doesn't convinces themselves they're too busy, that moderate exercise isn't that important anyway, that their job keeps them active enough. The person who eats poorly develops beliefs about nutrition that justify their diet, dismissing research that conflicts with their habits while embracing any study that gives their preferences a veneer of scientific support. The dissonance framework suggests why simply providing health information often fails to change behavior. The information creates dissonance, but people have many ways to reduce dissonance without changing their behavior. They don't necessarily respond to facts with open-minded reassessment. They respond with motivated reasoning that protects their current lifestyle. More effective approaches leverage dissonance differently. The hypocrisy paradigm, where people advocate for healthy behavior and then confront their own failures to practice it, has shown success in promoting exercise, safer sex, and other positive behaviors. Creating public commitments increases the dissonance associated with continued unhealthy behavior, reducing the identity implications of changing behavior, making it feel like natural evolution rather than admission of past error, can lower psychological barriers. For individuals trying to change their own health behaviors, understanding dissonance can be valuable. Recognize that your mind will generate reasons why change isn't necessary and be suspicious of these rationalizations. Know that the more you've invested in unhealthy patterns, the more your mind will protect them. Find ways to create cognitive pressure in the right direction. Make public commitments, surround yourself with people who model healthy behavior, and create conditions where continuing the old behavior would conflict with your self-concept. The development of dissonance. How does cognitive dissonance develop over the lifespan? Children aren't born with the same dissonance responses as adults, so understanding how these patterns emerge can tell us something important about their nature. Research suggests that children begin showing dissonance effects around age 4, coinciding with the development of a more coherent self-concept. Before this age, children don't seem bothered by inconsistency in the same way older children and adults are. But as they develop a sense of themselves as continuous beings with stable attributes, the motivation for internal consistency emerges. The classic spreading of alternatives effect, where chosen options are rated more positively and rejected options more negatively after a decision, begins appearing in preschoolers and strengthens through childhood. Interestingly, this effect seems to precede the development of more complex rationalizing abilities, suggesting it may be a fairly basic psychological mechanism rather than the product of sophisticated reasoning. As children grow older, their dissonance responses become more varied and sophisticated. They develop more creative ways to reduce dissonance, including complex justifications and reinterpretations that young children cannot yet produce. The cultural shaping of dissonance also takes hold, as children internalize the values of their society regarding what kinds of consistency matter and how inconsistency should be managed. Adolescence brings particularly intense dissonance experiences as young people work to establish their identities. The gap between the ideal self and the actual self often feels especially acute during this period, creating chronic dissonance that motivates identity exploration. Teenagers may experiment with different personas, looking for a self-concept that can encompass their various impulses and behaviors without unbearable contradiction. The development of dissonance has implications for child rearing and education. Parents and teachers often try to create consistency between children's behavior and desired values through external pressure and reward. But the dissonance literature suggests this approach may be counterproductive. If children attribute their good behavior to external forces, they don't experience the dissonance that would internalize the values. Better to create conditions where children feel they're freely choosing to behave well, so the dissonance between behavior and any contrary impulses gets resolved through genuine attitude change. The neuroscience of dissonance. As brain imaging technology has advanced, researchers have begun to investigate the neural basis of cognitive dissonance. Where in the brain does dissonance occur? What neural mechanisms underlie the discomfort it creates and the processing that reduces it? Studies using functional magnetic resonance imaging have consistently found that cognitive dissonance activates the anterior cingulate cortex, a region involved in conflict monitoring and error detection. This brain area seems to signal when something is wrong, when there's a mismatch between expectation and reality, or between different cognitive elements. The activation in this region during dissonance experiences supports the idea that dissonance is detected and processed as a kind of cognitive error that demands resolution. The insula, a region associated with negative emotional experiences including disgust and pain, also shows activation during dissonance. This corresponds with self-reports that dissonance feels unpleasant and with the observed motivation to reduce it. Dissonance isn't just an intellectual puzzle, it's an aversive state that the brain processes similarly to other forms of distress. When dissonance is successfully reduced through attitude change or rationalization, researchers observe changes in activity in the prefrontal cortex, particularly regions associated with reasoning and cognitive control. This suggests that dissonance reduction involves active cognitive work, not just passive adaptation. The brain is engaged in reconstructing interpretations and adjustments that restore consonance. Interestingly, research has also connected cognitive dissonance to the reward system. When people reduce dissonance through attitude change, they show activation in regions associated with pleasure and reward, including parts of the striatum. This suggests that resolving dissonance is not just relief from an aversive state, but a positively rewarding experience. We're not just motivated to avoid the pain of dissonance, we're motivated to seek the pleasure of resolution. The neuroscience of dissonance is still developing, and many questions remain about exactly how these processes unfold in the brain. But the research to date confirms that cognitive dissonance is a real psychological phenomenon with measurable neural signatures, not just a theoretical construct. The discomfort is real, the processing is real, and the attitude change that results is a genuine modification of how the brain represents beliefs and preferences. Cognitive dissonance and decision-making. Understanding cognitive dissonance fundamentally changes how we should think about decision-making. The rational model assumes we evaluate options, make choices, and then live with the consequences of those choices, with our evaluations remaining stable throughout. But dissonance research reveals that this is not how human minds actually work. Our evaluations of options are not fixed inputs to the decision process. They are outputs that change as a result of the process. Before choosing, you might rate two options very similarly. After choosing, you'll rate them quite differently, with the chosen option enhanced and the rejected option diminished. This means you can't trust your post-decision assessments as accurate reflections of the true comparison you made. Your mind has rewritten the evaluation to serve psychological comfort. This has important implications for how we should approach major decisions. Knowing that the spreading of alternatives will occur, we should invest more effort in pre-decision evaluation. When our assessments are less biased by commitment, we should be suspicious of our post-decision certainty, recognizing that it reflects rationalization as much as genuine insight, and we should consider that the confidence we feel about past decisions may say more about our talent for dissonance reduction than about the quality of the decisions themselves. The sunk cost fallacy, where people continue investing in failing endeavors because they've already invested so much, is closely connected to cognitive dissonance. Admitting that previous investments were wasted creates painful dissonance, so people convince themselves that continued investment is justified, that success is just around the corner, that giving up now would mean all the earlier sacrifice was for nothing. Understanding this can help us recognize when we're throwing good money after bad and give ourselves permission to cut our losses. Commitment escalation, where people become increasingly extreme in their positions after making initial commitments, is also driven by dissonance. Each step creates pressure to justify it, which often means taking another step in the same direction. This helps explain how people get drawn into cults, how organizations persist with failed strategies, and how conflicts spiral out of control. Recognizing this pattern can help us build in checkpoints where we deliberately reassess our path rather than being carried along by the momentum of justification. Dissonance reduction as a skill. Given how powerfully cognitive dissonance shapes our thoughts and behaviors, often in ways that don't serve us well, it's worth asking whether we can become more skillful in how we manage it. Can we learn to reduce dissonance in ways that promote truth and growth, rather than comfortable self-deception? The first step is simply awareness. Most dissonance reduction happens automatically and below conscious awareness. We don't decide to like our choices more, we just find ourselves feeling that way. We don't choose to dismiss contradictory evidence. It just seems less convincing. By understanding the mechanisms of dissonance, we can begin to notice when they might be operating and question our automatic responses. When you notice yourself strongly defending a decision or belief, ask whether that defense reflects genuine merit or psychological investment. When evidence against your position seems unconvincing, consider whether you might be motivated to find it unconvincing. When you feel certain about a choice you've made, remember that certainty is often a product of dissonance reduction rather than its cause. The second skill is creating psychological space for changing your mind. Much dissonance reduction is driven by the identity implications of admitting error. We don't want to see ourselves as wrong, foolish, or inconsistent, but if we can separate our self-worth from the correctness of any particular belief, if we can see changing our minds as a sign of intellectual virtue rather than weakness, the pressure to defend existing positions diminishes. Cultivating intellectual humility means genuinely accepting that you might be wrong about many things you currently believe, and that this is true for everyone. It means valuing accuracy over consistency, truth over comfort. It means being genuinely curious about challenges to your beliefs rather than automatically defensive. The third skill is choosing wisely what to commit to. Every commitment creates dissonance pressure, so we should be thoughtful about what we bind ourselves to. This doesn't mean avoiding commitment. Commitment is necessary for any meaningful endeavor, but it means being aware of the psychological costs of commitment and not making commitments lightly or unnecessarily. Public commitments carry more dissonance weight than private ones, so consider carefully before announcing your beliefs or decisions to others. High-effort investments create more dissonance than low-effort ones, so recognize that the more you put into something, the harder it will be to assess objectively. And remember that commitment tends to escalate, so be especially cautious about initial steps that might lead down paths you don't want to follow. Living with dissonance. Despite everything we've discussed about reducing cognitive dissonance, there's another possibility worth considering. Sometimes the best response to dissonance is neither to eliminate the contradiction through behavior change, nor to rationalize it away through belief change. Sometimes it's to simply live with it. Human beings are complicated creatures, and consistency may be overrated as a virtue. We contain multitudes, our beliefs don't always align with our behaviors, our values sometimes conflict with each other, and our self-concept may never perfectly match our actions. This isn't necessarily pathology to be corrected, it might just be the human condition. The drive to eliminate dissonance can sometimes do more harm than good. When we force premature resolution, we might change beliefs that actually contained truth or change behaviors that were actually fine. The discomfort of dissonance can be a signal worth attending to, not automatically suppressing. Maybe that uncomfortable feeling when your actions don't match your values is valuable information rather than a problem to be managed away. Some wisdom traditions have long recognized the value of holding contradictions without forcing resolution. The ability to maintain tension between opposing ideas, to sit with uncertainty and complexity, is seen as a kind of maturity. Quick resolution might be more comfortable, but patient dwelling with contradiction might be more enlightening. This isn't to say that all dissonance should be tolerated. When you're doing something genuinely harmful, the dissonance between that behavior and your values should prompt change. When your beliefs are clearly false, the dissonance between them and evidence should prompt updating. But not every dissonance requires immediate resolution. Sometimes understanding that you're experiencing dissonance and why is more valuable than rushing to make it go away. Cognitive dissonance in the modern world. The phenomenon of cognitive dissonance was first identified more than 60 years ago, but its relevance has only increased in our current environment. The modern world presents challenges to cognitive consistency that Festinger could never have imagined. We now live in a media environment where we can curate our information diet with unprecedented precision. Don't like what one news source says. There are dozens of others saying exactly what you want to hear. Find someone's argument challenging. Block them and fill your feed with voices that confirm your views. The tools of selective exposure have been supercharged by technology, making it easier than ever to avoid information that would create dissonance. Social media amplifies these tendencies. Algorithms learn what we engage with and serve us more of the same, creating filter bubbles that reinforce existing beliefs. Public posting creates commitment that makes changing our minds psychologically costly. The tribal dynamics of online discourse push people toward more extreme positions to signal group loyalty. All of these mechanisms exacerbate the natural human tendency toward dissonance avoidance and belief perseverance. At the same time, we're confronted with more challenges to our beliefs than ever before. The internet exposes us to perspectives from around the world, undermining the comfortable assumption that our local consensus represents universal truth. Scientific research accelerates, sometimes overturning established knowledge in ways that challenge our understanding. Social change progresses rapidly, making yesterday's conventional wisdom today's controversy. The dissonance potential of modern life is enormous, even as the tools for avoiding that dissonance have grown more powerful. This creates a kind of choice point for each of us. We can use the capabilities of our information environment to construct comfortable bubbles where our beliefs are never challenged and our inconsistencies are never exposed. Or we can deliberately seek out dissonance, exposing ourselves to views we disagree with, questioning our own certainties, and using the discomfort as fuel for growth. The choice has implications not just for individual well-being, but for collective outcomes. Democracies depend on citizens who can consider evidence, change their minds, and find common ground despite differences. Scientific progress requires challenging established ideas and updating in response to new evidence. Social progress requires confronting the dissonance between our ideals and our practices. If we all retreat into dissonance-free bubbles, these collective processes break down. The value of psychological pain. Throughout this essay, we've discussed cognitive dissonance as something uncomfortable that we're motivated to reduce, but it's worth pausing to appreciate the value of this discomfort. The pain of dissonance is not a design flaw in human psychology. It serves important functions. The discomfort of dissonance alerts us to contradictions that matter. When your behavior conflicts with your values, the unpleasant feeling is a signal that something is wrong, that you're not living up to your own standards. This signal can motivate genuine change and growth. Without it, we might drift through life in comfortable inconsistency, never confronting the gaps between who we want to be and who we actually are. The unease of recognizing that your beliefs might be wrong is what makes learning possible. If we were entirely comfortable with our existing views, we'd never be motivated to update them. The dissonance between cherished beliefs and contradicting evidence, uncomfortable as it is the engine of intellectual growth. The most dangerous belief system is one that protects itself too well, that never allows the discomfort that would prompt revision. The psychological cost of commitment is what makes commitment meaningful. If we could commit to things without any dissonance, without any psychological investment, our commitments would be shallow and easily abandoned. The fact that commitment changes us, that it creates pressure to follow through, is what gives it power. The dissonance we experience when contemplating breaking a commitment is what holds us to our word. So while we've discussed many strategies for reducing dissonance, and while some of those strategies represent problematic self-deception, dissonance itself is not the enemy. The discomfort it creates is information about the state of our minds and lives. Learning to use that information wisely, neither suppressing it through rationalization nor being paralyzed by it, is part of psychological maturity. Conclusion. We began with the observation that there is a war inside your head, a constant tension between different versions of yourself. Having explored cognitive dissonance in depth, we can now appreciate both how pervasive this war is and how we might engage with it more wisely. Cognitive dissonance is not a curious quirk of human psychology that shows up in clever experiments but has no real-world relevance. It operates constantly in every domain of life, shaping our beliefs about ourselves and the world in ways we rarely recognize. Every decision you've made, every belief you've held, every relationship you've maintained has been influenced by the drive to reduce the discomfort of internal contradiction. This is both humbling and empowering. It's humbling because it reveals that we are not the rational agents we imagine ourselves to be. We don't coolly evaluate evidence and reach logical conclusions. We construct narratives. We rationalize our choices. We see what we need to see to maintain psychological comfort. The beliefs we hold most confidently may say more about our psychological investments than about the truth of the matter. But understanding dissonance is also empowering because it gives us tools for working with our own minds more skillfully. When you understand why you're motivated to dismiss certain evidence, you can compensate for that motivation. When you recognize that your certainty about past decisions reflects dissonance reduction, you can hold that certainty more lightly. When you see how commitment escalation works, you can build in checkpoints to reassess. Knowledge of your cognitive biases doesn't eliminate them, but it does give you a fighting chance against them. Perhaps most importantly, understanding cognitive dissonance can increase our compassion, both for ourselves and for others. When you watch someone cling to beliefs despite overwhelming evidence, when you see them rationalize harmful behavior, when you observe them trapped in patterns that obviously don't serve them, you can recognize that they're not stupid or evil. They're human, subject to the same psychological forces that shape your own mind. This doesn't mean accepting harmful behavior or refusing to challenge false beliefs, but it might mean approaching these situations with more understanding of why change is so difficult. The war inside your head will never end. As long as you're human, you will experience contradictions between your beliefs, your actions, and your self-concept. You will feel the discomfort of dissonance and be motivated to make it go away. The question is not whether this will happen, but how you will respond to it. You can respond by becoming ever more skilled at self-deception, constructing an increasingly elaborate fortress of rationalization that protects you from any uncomfortable truth. Many people choose this path, often without realizing they've chosen anything at all. They end up living in a comfortable fiction, confident in beliefs that don't match reality, trapped in patterns they cannot see, wondering why their lives aren't working despite their certainty that they're doing everything right. Or you can respond by developing what we might call dissonance wisdom. This means using the discomfort of dissonance as information rather than automatically suppressing it. It means being curious about challenges to your beliefs rather than defensive. It means making commitments thoughtfully, aware of the psychological costs involved. It means recognizing that changing your mind is a strength rather than a weakness, and that sitting with uncertainty can be more valuable than rushing to resolution. The choice between these paths is never made once and for all. It's made in thousands of small moments. When you encounter evidence against something you believe, when you realize your actions don't match your values, when you face the question of whether to acknowledge a mistake or double down on it. In each of these moments, you have the opportunity to choose growth over comfort, truth over consistency, the discomfort of genuine insight over the false peace of rationalization. Cognitive dissonance will continue to operate in your mind whether you understand it or not. But with understanding, you have the possibility of working with it rather than being controlled by it. You can use its discomfort as a guide toward greater truth and better alignment between who you want to be and who you actually are. You can recognize when you're being pulled towards self-deception and choose a different path. You can hold your beliefs more humbly, make your decisions more wisely, and maintain your relationships more honestly. The war inside your head cannot be won in the sense of eliminating contradiction entirely, but it can be engaged with more skillfully, more courageously, and more honestly. Understanding cognitive dissonance is an invitation to that engagement, an opportunity to become a more integrated and authentic version of yourself. That opportunity is yours to accept or decline, moment by moment, for the rest of your life.